Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Welcome to episode 4 of Tax, Tech and Other Stuff. Really excited today. Another external guest, second one in a row. We're doing well. We're on a roll. With me today is Jonathon Artus. John Artus is somebody that I've worked with for quite a few years now. But rather than me introduce myself, why don't you go ahead, John? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Russell. Yes, so my name is Jonathon Artus. I'm a client director at a software company called Softwire.
And how long have you been there, and what do you kind of do? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I have been at Softwire for coming up for 10 years now. Before that, my background is accounting and finance technology. So I started my career at Deloitte about 16 years ago now. Originally trained as an accountant, spent a bit of time in tax technology, actually writing code on some of their sort of tax technology solutions. And then, moved to Softwire about 10 years ago, really just to kind of focus a bit more on the craft of writing software and to do it in a few different industries.
Nice, yeah. We'll talk a little bit about tax because, yes, you go back in the world of tax technology even longer than me, which is always a good thing. In terms of software, tell us a bit more about the business. Who do you work with? How big's the business? What's your customer base? All those kind of good things.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were founded in the year 2000. We've grown fairly organically since the original 3 founders, and we're up to about 350 people now.
Nice.
We're based in Kentish Town in North London, just north of the trendy parts of Camden, but we also now have offices in Cambridge, just down the road from your lovely podcast studio, and also in Manchester and Bucharest as well. So we've kind of grown fairly organically as a business. We are very sector agnostic, and actually that's one of my favourite things about working here. So we work with everything from sort of government through to private and third sector. I do a lot of my work in the financial services industry still, so working with large insurers like RSA and Zurich, but also with a whole spectrum of clients in energy and utilities, and also sort of third sector and public sector. So I do a lot of work with Anthony Nolan, who are a blood cancer charity, which is really fascinating, and also more recently with Moorfields Eye Hospital and Google Health as well.
Nice, yeah. You've got some very cool clients on your list. I remember we were chatting about the work you're doing there. We might touch on that in a little bit. But I guess what does a kind of typical day look like for you? What do you do day to day, or is there no 2 days are the same?
I mean, no 2 days are the same, and this is a very atypical day itself. But broadly speaking, I've got 2 functions. So I am fortunate enough to have a team of about 50 really bright and enthusiastic software engineers who are very much at the forefront of their craft and are, frankly, almost a handful because they are bright and buzzing and have lots of ideas. About half my job is finding interesting problems for them to solve. So I spend quite a lot of time on the road talking to clients about their problems, helping to kind of have early conversations, shape opportunities, and kind of basically establish if people have problems that would be a good fit for us to solve. Mm-hmm. So that's about half the time. The other half of the time then is kind of working with my team, sort of mentoring them, helping make sure that then once we've found an interesting problem that we solve it really, really well and that we deliver on all the promises that we've made. And if there are roadblocks, if there are bumps in the road, if things go a little bit wrong, helping to kind of straighten things out and sort of coach and mentor the teams as well. So it's kind of a 50-50 split between those 2 aspects.
So would you say you're a little bit different to, obviously there are lots of, software engineering, development, outsource type businesses. If anything, my LinkedIn inbox is full of people saying, would you like some engineers? That's a pretty typical day. For me, are you a little bit different then? Are you in that kind of problem-solving aspect? Do you operate a little bit differently to your kind of classic dev shop, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. I think we really we do our best work as an organisation where clients have important problems that they really need to solve, and where they don't just want to kind of get 10 engineers to come and sit in a room and write code. So we're much more outcomes based. So we take a hard business problem and then we kind of really own the outcome of actually fixing the business problem and not just kind of cutting code for a day rate.
Gotcha. Nice. And I mentioned a little bit before, obviously, so we've worked together a few times. You tend to find yourself all the way back to tax. Again, you can't escape. I found exactly the same, to be fair. I did a lot of tax technology for a while. I then went and did 3 or 4 years of regulatory technology, which is, adjacent, I suppose, but at least was very much in the banking sector rather than necessarily pure tax. And then the next job, immediately back to tax, and then spent some time with VAT and now corporation tax. So you, like me, seem to have found your way back in. How does that keep happening?
I mean, you can't escape tax and finance in the end. It is ultimately everywhere. But I think a part of it is that actually, I talked earlier about trying to find difficult and interesting problems for my teams because, that's really what engages them and gets them out of bed. And actually, though it's deeply uncool to say so, tax is actually really interesting, and there are lots of really interesting nuances. There's a really interesting kind of business domain to learn about, and actually all of that deep finance, we've done some really interesting problems in the actuarial space where the teams have found it fascinating to learn about how actuaries work and how they predict when you're going to die and that sort of thing. But there's so much complexity under the hood, and it's those kind of difficult, complex problems like all over the place in tax technology that actually my teams get really into, and they enjoy geeking out about the business domain.
And we'll talk a bit more about the AlphaMap project. We'll talk about that shortly. But it is always interesting because when we started the main project that we've been working with you guys on, you almost feel sort of duty bound in the introduction to be like, I'm really sorry, guys, you're working in tax. No one wants to work in tax. Boo, it's boring. But actually, as you say, as soon as you actually get into the problems, they are fascinating and they are different. And actually, it's not just about kind of sitting in a room and solving problems that you've kind of solved before and just kind of doing that. It's actually, okay, well, yes, you might have seen similar themes or similar-ish problems, but actually the fact that it's in tax and finance and some of the weird and wonderful nuances of the world that we work in actually means that the team have really got stuck in and they've actually learned a bit about it on the way as well, which has always been nice to see. Some of your bright minds that are relatively fresh out of university going, I never knew that about that. And now you kind of go, well, you're still an excellent software engineer, but you know a small bit about tax as well, which will
absolutely
stand them in good stead. So I guess moving on then to the work we've been doing together. So we're talking about AlphaMap. The product is launching next week as we record this. So by the time it goes out, it will have indeed launched, which is great news. So talk me through how that's come about in terms of us working on that together.
I mean, as with all great ideas in the world of business, it started with a conversation in a slightly unsalubrious pub near Waterloo Station. But it came at a really interesting time, actually, that we just happened to be having a catch-up because I think it was just after OpenAI had launched GPT-3.5, which is one of the first versions that they released that really started to blow people's minds. And I think we've been aware for a couple of years that generative AI as a technology is going to disrupt both our industry but also most of our clients as well. And we were really starting to do some kind of heavy-duty thinking about, well, what do we need to do to respond to this? And it turned out when we met up that you had been doing some really similar thinking internally within tax systems and thinking about actually where in your value chain is this going to have an impact. And it was actually really fascinating taking the somewhat abstract thinking I'd been doing and comparing it to the notes that you'd come up with around actually, a few dozen use cases where it could really impact your clients' workflows and just sort of seeing the mapping between those. So I think it kind of evolved quite naturally from that conversation of, well, here's where it could disrupt into, well, great, and how do we test that?
Yeah, and that was it. We, and just before we met, me and a couple of guys in the office had sat down for a day with a whiteboard and start at the very left of a tax process and finish at the very right of a tax process. So all the way from the very first things you do, putting data out of systems, all the way through to filing to HMRC, and kind of sat down and went, okay, well, where could this stuff play? And then took that and ranked some ideas and thought, well, it's always lovely to have these, grand ideas. Okay, we're just going to build a bot that is going to go in and everyone's going to get all their tax advice. I've seen just this week, in fact, PwC have announced that they're launching a bot internally that will try and do exactly that. And it'll be really interesting to see how that works. But that's clearly a much bigger use case that will take an awful lot of time to work through and solve. And no doubt that is the first pass of something that will continue to roll over the coming years. But we took a look at that and went, okay, where are the client pain problems where this might make a big bit of difference? And settled on, I think, 3 that we worked on. But we spun it up pretty quickly. I remember having the conversation with Bruce, the CEO, and being like, look, we just got to do this. We've got to do some research. And actually, I think many people would be surprised as to how quickly we kind of got that up and running in terms of just researching the concept, not only from getting I was going to say bums on seats, specifically a bum on seat. He's a guy called Ant, who's very lovely and very smart. Yep. Getting him on a seat to really go through these problems. But I mean, we did that work in 8 weeks, I think?
8 weeks end to end, and we're getting interim results that were really starting to prove the concept within a few days almost of starting.
Exactly, and then we kind of fed them back and have gone through, and we'll talk a bit more about the product in a little bit. But I guess broadening out really specifically from AlphaMap just for a second, are you seeing this kind of happening with other customers, other industries, other other bits and bobs of people kind of asking you for the same sorts of things. How's that working specific to Gen AI?
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of people are talking about it. What we're observing at the moment in the market is that a lot of people are trapped in that headspace of it's a slightly better chatbot than can go and read some documents. And lots of people want it for internal knowledge-based access. They want it for kind of summarization tasks. They want it for transcription tasks. And lots of people are doing like what PwC mentioned, where you're finding a really large corpus of knowledge and using it for better access to that. But that's kind of where the thinking seems to stop in a lot of cases. And I think actually the tax systems work has been a very different flavour of use case from what most of our clients are asking for. And I think what you guys have really successfully done when you found the the alpha map scope is you found some areas where actually it's not just sort of summarizing text, it's actually replacing human judgment. And that tax preparation process of working out, well, given a particular narrative that's come out of an accounting system, where does that map to in a trial balance? That's actually really quite a fine sort of piece of judgment that somebody has to have context, they have to have knowledge and expertise. And I think you quite successfully identified that actually that's a really specific and very deep tax technical thing that actually is quite readily achievable with Gen AI.
Yeah, and that's why I suppose we did the research, because we didn't know, right? We could have thrown it in and it could have been 30, 40% accurate. And indeed, in the very first pass, I think it was something like 58, 59% accurate. We looked at it and went, okay, it's all right, but it's certainly not good enough from the point of view of building something. But then, it was about them refining, and how do we, some of that is prompt engineering, some of that's approach and strategy, some of it's fine tuning and training, and few shot messaging and all sorts of different wonderful stuff. We've dived into some really weird, wonderful kind of holes with Ant over the coming the past few months, but to get that up has probably been a really interesting set. And I think you're right. It's yes, it can absolutely do those kind of jobs where you're looking at a corpus and trying to then kind of summarize. And I've seen use cases. Another use case I saw was one of the other big accountancy firms has basically put all of their internal policies on an internal chatbot. So if you want to ask about your holiday allowance or your sick leave or any of these things, you don't have to go and trawl through hundreds of pages of policy documents. You just simply pop up a chatbot and ask it, and it gives you a good answer. So there are loads of use cases like that. Don't get me wrong; they're very valid, but I do think we tried to think about it a little bit differently, which is nice. So, are you getting more variants, do you think, over the next few months in terms of the kind of projects and challenges you're seeing, or where is it going?
It's an interesting question. So I think more people are starting to see beyond the chatbot as options. We've been speaking recently to a client who's looking to effectively develop an AI focus group. And so there's a really interesting question of, if you get a variety of different models and train them on a variety of different corpuses of conversational data and preference data, can you actually start to produce a demographically representative sort of sample of chatbots? So imagine you have 1,000 chatbots covering a kind of demographically representative section of the population, and you start to throw slogans or ideas, or actually the interesting one they're looking at is phrasing. So if you're worried about how something is phrased and is it comprehensible, does it evoke a particular reaction, can you actually use 1,000 differently trained AIs to give you a proportionately representative sample of what the population would make of that?
Interesting. That sounds like a really fun challenge. My brain's going off on a totally random tangent at the moment, as it normally would with these things. It almost feels like you're building a chatbot of chatbots, some sort of master chatbot to take over the world.
And it is exactly that. It's kind of your demographic chatbot. It's like, great, what is the general public going to make of this particular idea? And we don't know, but it'll be a really interesting kind of concept to test.
Yeah, and it was one of the things that is relevant to our work that makes me think of is that, and it's one of the early things that when we started going through sort of prompt engineering and how do you make some of this stuff better, it was surprising to see just how much, and this is maybe giving away a bit of a secret, but I think it's totally relevant. If you put "I am a corporation tax expert" into the prompt, it suddenly goes, oh, hang on, well, rather than just doing what I was asked, I'm now really good at corporation tax, so I'll actually improve the results. So every time I'm writing a prompt for anything these days, I'm always kind of going, okay, well, I want to play around and have an assessment of, we've been looking, for example, a little bit at fixed assets. Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to tell it is I've been classifying fixed assets for many years, and I'm an excellent professional. You'd be surprised at just how much that boosts results, which is also just baffling to me.
It's really fascinating, and we found the same in some preliminary tests with age data. So if you say, I'm a 74-year-old woman, you get very different outputs from saying I'm a 16-year-old boy. And it's fascinating. This comes back to the question of training and bias, and it's very apparent that large language models have picked up a load of stereotypes.
Yeah.
They have stereotypical attitudes and behaviours that are encoded in the models, and it's a really interesting alignment question for the people making these models of actually how do you avoid negative stereotypes or unfair stereotypes in those. But yes, they're clearly there, and you can experiment with that through setting the system prompt.
Yeah, and also, I'm sure you saw a couple of weeks ago, the GPT-4 was getting lazy, and I'd actually noticed it getting a bit lazy. You'd ask it to, I might, for example, feed in 20 or 30 categories and say, okay, here are these 30 lines, and I want you to give me an answer. And it would just start going, okay, well, I'm going to give you the top 10, and just, that's cool. Here's the top 10, and if you want any more, let me know. And then you have to ask it again. It's like, I'll give you another 10. It's just like, I just asked you for 30, just do 30. So they've actually had to, and I don't know how it works behind the scenes, of course, but they've actually had to change it so that it becomes less lazy, which to me is fascinating, that these models can actually become lazier over time.
Yeah, it's interesting how they're evolving this. And I think some of that is the that feedback loop they've put in where you grade the answers, and some of that is them trying to demand level. I think that example is one where actually they've realised people are asking for 30 examples and only look at the first 10, and actually it costs them computing power to give the extra 20, so they've throttled it back. But the other one I've noticed over the last couple of months in particular is that it will refuse a lot more requests and say, oh no, actually I'm only an AI model, I don't have any expertise in that space.
Yep.
And I think one of the questions about how you productionize these systems is what happens if your AI goes on strike?
Yeah.
And it does happen. It will turn around and say, well, actually, I'm not a tax technology expert. I don't feel qualified to answer that.
And that probably feeds quite nicely back into just finishing off the conversation around AlphaMap, because we've, wouldn't it just be lovely if you could write a prompt, chuck stuff in, get stuff out, and all the rest of it? But we've had to go through an awful lot of hoops in terms of working through, fail and retries. For example, we are using the OpenAI technology, albeit Microsoft's version, so it's all housed within Azure and all secure and all the rest of it. But sometimes, if you ask it something, it will just go, no, I'm not doing that. So we have to then obviously retry and put things through. And actually, what that means is that behind the scenes, there is an awful lot of stuff going on, yet to the user, it just looks like, oh, I've just popped off a request and here comes some answers, which is, again, quite a nice part of this. It's not necessarily just the generative AI power that's behind the scenes, but actually how do you present it to a user? Which is something you guys have worked through. So just talk to me a bit more about how that the kind of production project. We did 8 weeks of research. We went away and went, that's really good. And then in November we started a full scale kind of production level build, which is what we'll be releasing shortly. So give us a bit more information about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've productionized these technologies with a few different clients now, and every time we work through taking it to production, we learn more about the different things you need to make it successful. And I think with tax systems in particular, what we've really learned is how important the design of the user experience is in overcoming limitations with what OpenAI's technology can currently do. So one of the things we found is that ChatGPT ultimately does take a while to come back. And there's a fine balance between if you batch your results up, it saves you cost in the long term, but it also takes longer to process a batch.
Yep.
And so what we've had to do is look into, for example, sending the first few requests as individual items to display to the user for review, and then to gradually increase the batch size for efficiency as, So what that means is we're quickly returning some results to the user, which makes it feel snappy, but then we're doing the rest in larger chunks, which is more efficient overall. So things like that are really important. But there's also a lot behind the scenes. So you mentioned that kind of fail and retry, and actually quite often you do get API errors back because either they're too busy or you've hit a quota limit or things like that. For other clients, what we've looked at doing is actually having a pool of APIs that we can access. So we'll get multiple different API keys, multiple different accounts, and we'll have to write some logic behind the scenes to effectively load balance between those so that we can cope with kind of big peaks.
Yeah.
but also that failure detection, building in enough observability into the way that you access these AIs is really important, because you want to detect if your error rate increases over time. Because it might be that the machine is coming back and saying no to a request. It might be that more things are failing because particular types of queries unexpectedly confuse the AI. So building in sort of those sorts of patterns at a very foundational level, but also building in the tooling to observe what is happening is really, really important. And it's easy to overlook that and suddenly find that actually it's not working for a subset of your users.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is there's a lot that we've had to go through to make sure that the product is out and will work properly, albeit there's still loads of unknowns and things that we just need to monitor and make sure that we're watching on a continual basis, because, as you say, it's still relatively new, particularly to production processes. There's obviously, anyone can go and log on to ChatGPT and, if you want, put $20 a month in the meter and play with the Plus model and play with GPT-4. But, getting actually, from that, which is, nice and fun and interesting and can, help with the day job. I'm definitely one of the people, as I'm sure you are, that uses this stuff on a pretty much daily basis just to make my life easier and more efficient from a work point of view. But actually turning that into a product is probably a bit of a different task. So I think moving a little bit on from generative AI, at the risk of this becoming the generative AI podcast, of which I'm sure there are many. What else are you seeing in the market, in your market? I guess with a sort of 2024 lens, what else is big and in vogue and on topic right now that you're seeing?
I mean, it's interesting. I think Gen AI has almost stolen everything else's thunder. So there's still the kind of continual migration towards the cloud. There's still a lot of focus actually on sort of improved customer experience as a differentiator, and that's one we're getting quite a lot of requests for. I think more businesses, as they become fully digital, are really worried that their customers are going to leave them if they have a bad time online. And you see this particularly in the insurance and financial services sectors, where insurers want you to have a great time whenever you have a touch point with them. So that remains a kind of general concern, but actually more and more companies are looking to solve that concern with Gen AI, and it's a question of actually how do you write a really high quality conversational interface that lets people interact in novel ways with your company.
Yeah, and I'm sure everybody has seen, or certainly you will have seen, and a lot of people have seen the DPD chatbot that they put out there, which was maybe they could have done a little bit more to train it, shall I say, because you could ask it to write you a haiku on how bad DPD was as a customer delivery service. You could ask it to swear for you, and maybe those aren't the experiences you necessarily want.
Oh, that is true. And they do go viral. They generate some
Yes.
publicity for a business, but they're not necessarily the right sorts of publicity. And
Yes.
I mean, actually, those sorts of guardrails around AIs, particularly anything open to the general public, is another one of those evolving areas that we're working quite hard on. Actually, how do you prevent prompt injection? How do you actually prevent it saying something that's going to embarrass the company? And there are various different approaches to take on those sorts of things. But it's as yet not a solved problem. And, in the same category as hallucinations, where AIs will still make things up sometimes if they think it's what you want to hear.
Yeah.
And, I'd still think we're in a situation where Gen AI is best as a co-pilot where there is a human in the loop.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason that your use cases work so well for AlphaMap.
Yeah, and I think and the co-pilot point's a good one. We're actually rolling it out in our business over the next couple of weeks. I'm one of the pilot users, as you would imagine, so I'm going to be hammering Microsoft Copilot and seeing what. And I think there's been a positive reception, but it's not necessarily, and specifically to Microsoft Copilot, it's not necessarily been the blow away that everyone's gone, oh my God, that's amazing. I think what I've seen is that people are saying it's very good in certain instances. I think the teams and the meetings and the note taking and the sentiment analysis, some of that stuff is really good. Certainly people who have looked at it for, say, Excel are less positive on just how much it might boost efficiency. So I think it's early days in that space. It'll be really interesting to see where it goes. Clearly, Microsoft have bet the farm on it, so it's not going to fall over, I wouldn't have thought. But it certainly isn't, as you say, a solved problem just yet.
Yes, it hasn't. I think it will be a few years before it gets to the point where it's really good and natural enough that it will sort of hit that tipping point and everyone will start using it.
Yeah. And on to, I guess, final question for the day, although I could sit here and talk about this stuff for hours. What would be your kind of one piece of advice to our customers? What would you say about, Gen AI or anything? What would you kind of counsel them to consider?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate the full breadth of use cases for Gen AI, and also how quickly the industry is moving. And almost every day there's a major announcement of some quite startling new capabilities. So this morning's was OpenAI releasing their text to video model,
Oh, yeah, I
which
saw
is
that.
it's absolutely unbelievable. The quality of what you can produce as a video clip from a really simple text prompt. And so that technology, if you'd asked me a year ago how long that would take, I'd have said, oh, it's 5 to 10 years away before you'll get convincing videos. And so this is moving really, really quickly as an industry. And it is going to disrupt your business or your supply chains in ways that you don't foresee. And I guess what I'd say is keep having conversations, go and talk to people about it, make sure that where you've got advisors or suppliers that you're working with, talk to them about what they're doing with it, and just try and sort of understand where it is impacting the industry.
Yeah.
And I guess the second half of that is it is surprisingly quick and cheap to actually spin up a pilot to say, great, could it disrupt this area of my business? And within a few weeks, you can get a really good idea of, is it going to disrupt my business this year? Is it still a few years off potentially? Or actually, is this an area where it's probably not a fit? But really be vigilant for what those areas might be, and don't be afraid to try them out.
Yeah, and that's I think that kind of sparks two thoughts in my brain. Firstly, you're right that not everything is a hit. We have now done. We're on our fifth use case of research with you guys. Two of them have turned into AlphaMap. One of them has turned into some interesting research around the world of RxBRL that I definitely won't delve into, but there's some interesting thoughts and theories around that one. But one of them, actually, we looked at taking sort of messy data and data formats, when you get ERP data out, and could we use it to kind of structure it in a better way? And actually, the assessment at the time when we did this all the way, I think back in May last year, which feels like a lifetime ago in the world of Gen AI, was that it's not really the right technology for that, for a number of reasons, for things like security, for data size and things like that. Now, it's definitely not the right technology for it now, but that doesn't mean that it's not the right technology for it in a year or 2 years. And as you say, it might have been in my head 5 or 10 years away, but actually maybe it is a year away.
But actually, one of the related points to that, in the process of productionizing these tools, some of our tech people have coined a law that they call the law of minimum use, which states that Gen AI is at its most effective when you use it as little as possible. And it's really tempting to take big, hairy problems like, taking some unstructured data and trying to interpret it, and to hand the whole thing off to an AI and say, just figure it out.
Yep.
But actually what we find is if you can do some or most of the task using kind of traditional software engineering approaches, and then just use AI for that tiny little bit at the end where you're, say, mapping column headings or something like that, the overall result is generally better. So while it is huge and powerful, don't try and use it for everything. Yeah,
and I think that's right. And actually, now you're getting me thinking about how we can go relook at this. But ultimately, you're saying, okay, you want you to find out where in the file this data is, but then you're not asking it to actually get the data and put it into the columns and do the things, because that can be done in a much simpler type Python type way. And I think we see the same thing in tax and the sticky question of maths. Tax involves doing lots of maths, and maths has to be 100% right. And large language models are not the right place to be doing maths. But if you can get the large language model to understand, well, these are the things that I need to know about and calculate, and then hand them off to a calculator that is good at maths, then that's a much better approach.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. Again, as I say, I could have sat here and talked about this for hours, and it would make the editing job particularly tricky if we did. So thank you very much for your time, John, and really appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.